Chapter I. The Road That. Learn Road. There is a name that conjures deserts and caravans silk. The creaking of laden camels, a croaching of sand. We call it the Silk Road, but that the name is misleading, and understanding why is misleading is the first understanding of the ling of rats. Acts actually was. The term Silk Road, Seidenstrasse in German, was coined in 1777 and 877. A geographer for Feathered Ferdinand von Richthofen, who used it to describe the ancient trade routes Canina to the Mediterranean world. It was a brilliant piece of naming, evocative and memorable, and hence is stuck. But it was never a single road. It was a vast, shifting web of overland tracks, river valleys, mountain passes, and sea lanes changed their precise configurations, and depending on political conditions, seasonal weather, the location of water sources, and the commercial priorities of any given era. At its greatest extent, the network of roads that we call the Silk Road stretched from the Chinese capital of Chang'an, modern Xi'an, westward across Central Asia through the oasis cities of Danwang, Kashgar, Samarkand, and Merv, and onward to the Mediterranean shores of Syria and the Black Sea, ports that connected to the markets of Rome, Constantinople, and Alexandria. Parallel routes extended southward into India, and by sea across the Indian Ocean to the Persian Gulf and the Red Sea. Total dans from one ether exceeded 12,000 kilometers, and no single traveler, merchant, or pilgrim traversed the entire length in the single journey. The routes were old, far older than the Han Dynasty's Chinese expansion into Central Asia's as the conventional starting point of Silk Road history, long before for the Chinese military pushed westward into the Tarim Basin in the 2nd century BE. Animals and items had been moving along sections of these routes for millennia. Bronze Age cultures across Europe exchanged gimbers and prestige objects cross distances that once seemed impossible. What the Han Dynasty expansion did was connect these pre-existing exchange netting something systematic, multiply managed, and vastly more consequential for the Silk ends at both ends. The true cargo of the Silk Road was never only silk. It was never only any one ding. Silk was important. It was the prestige textile of the ancient world. associated with China in the minds of everyone from Roman senators, Danipers, to Byzantine emperors. And it traveled in enormous quantities along these routes for centuries. But the caravans also carried glass, cotton, gold, linen, gold, silver, iron, tin, horses, furs, amber, corally, gems, and spices, sperms, perfumes, dyes, and porcelain. They carried agricultural products, and their kits and manufactured goods, weapons and medicines. And they carried something that cannot be weighed or counted. The counted philosophies, artistic styles, scientific knowledge, and the infectious energy of human curiosity about distant peoples and distant ways of living. Chapter 2, Chang'an. The city at the eastern end of the world. In the 7th and 8th centuries of the Common Era, the city of Chang'an was almost certainly most cosmopolitan, most magnificent city on earth. The Tang Dynasty capital sprawled across an area of approximately 84 square kilometers, larger than any contemporary city in Europe or the Islamic world. And its population may have approached 2 million people. To arrive in Chang'an, crossing the distant of Central Asia was enter a world of staggering scale and dazzling complexity. This is built out a rational plan, a vast rectangular grid divided into wide, tree-lined avenues. The widest of these avenues, the Imperial the Imstray, ran straight from the southern main gate to the Imperial and Eels complex at the city's northern end, a distance of 5 kilometers. On festival days, this avenue became the stage for processions of extraordinary grandeur, emperor's retinue, the court's ceremonial guard, and the great mass of the city's population gathered on either side. Chang'an was merely Chinese. It was, by the standards of any age, an international city. Persian merchants maintained communities within the city walls. Sucking Centrum's Asia. The great commercial intermediaries of the Silk Road had their own quarters and their own fire temples. Nestorian Christian communities worshipped in their miniature churches. Manichaeans gathered in their assembly halls. Buddhist monks from India, Central Asia, and Southeast Asia filled the city's numerous monasteries. Arab and Jewish merchants traded it in Eastern and Western markets. The Tang Dynasty's cosmopolitan appetite was genuine and remarkable. The markets of Chang'an were one of the city's most extraordinarily features. two great markets, the Eastern Market and the Western Market, were the principal commercial centers, each organized industriales where physical goods could be found. The Western Market, in particular, was the node through which Silk Road goods entered the city's common life. Its lanes were filled with foreign merchants and exotic merchandise. Texts from the Tang period describe with fascination the goods that could be found there. Guns ergra from Persia, spices from India and Southeast Asia, horses from the steppes, musicians and entertainers from the oasis cities of Central Asia. The Tang emperors themselves were enthusiastic consumers of the exotic goods the Silk Road delivered to their capital. Court records document the importation of lions and ostriches, of fine wine from the Turfan oases, of lionesses of Afghanistan, from Perm, Afghanistan, and pearls from the Persian Gulf. Tang dynasty reflects this absorption, foreign influences, remarkable directness. Ceramic figurines of Central Asian musicians playing lutes, of camel riders wearing the distinctive costumes of the steppes, foreigners with large eyes and blue pleated set eyes that identify them immediately. Chinese. The Tang court wore these foreign influences as marks of prestige and sophistication. Chang'an was also, and the knowledge that arrived along the Silk Road was as eagerly received. Commodity. Buddhist scriptures brought from India by pilgrim, says the monk Xuanzang, who made Feihingxiang, made his famous journey to India and back in the early 7th century, were translated in true translating use in great translation bureaus, staffed by international teams of scholars, mathematical and astronomical knowledge, and adding its way in the Tang academies. Medical texts were exchanged. The movement of ideas along the Silk Road was in the long run, even more consequential than the movement of goods. Chapter 3. The Tarim Basin, deserts, oases, and this is his famed west. To travel west from Chang'an in the Dynasty era was followed by had been merchants, pilgrims, diplomats, and soldiers for centuries. The road led through the Gansu corridor, a narrow strip of habitable land between the mountains of Tibet, the south, and the Gorth, and Borza to the north, passing through the fortress towns that march of Chail. Imperial control. At Dunhuang, the Chinese oasis, was faced a choice. The road split, and the northern and southern branches separated to skirt the edges of the Taklamakan Desert. Is one of the most forbidding landscapes on Earth. The desert covers an area of 170,000 square kilometers. Make it the world's second largest shifting sand desert. Its summers are brutally hot, its winters bitterly cold, and its winds, Karens, fine silt particles that can reduce visibility to nothing and fill the lungs of the unwary. Yet, for more than 1,000 years, this desert was carrying the goods and ideas East Asia to the rest of the world. Peace was the oasis along the northern and southern edge of the desert, where rivers descending from the surrounding mountain ranges spread their water across the desert floor, woofer disappearing into the sands. Clusters own the Tahend made survival possible. These oases, Turfan, Kucha, Kulia Lulan, were not mere watering holes. Sophisticated urban centers with their own curs, with their own cultures, languages, religious traditions, and political structures. They were the anchors of the Silk Road, the points which Central Asia would have impossible. Turfan, the first major oasis on the northern route from Dunyuan, preserves some of the most remarkable evidence of Silk Roads as civilization has survived anywhere. The extreme aridity of the Turfan Depression lies with well below sea level and receives almost no rainfall, had preserved organic materials that would have decayed long ago in moister climates. Archaeologists working in the ruins of ancient towns have recovered manuscripts in Chinese, Sogdian, Sanskrit, Tibetan, and dozen other languages. Silk textiles with Chinese, Persian, and Byzantine influenced designs. Wooden administrative documents, recording the details of commercial transactions, and food offerings, bread, dumplings, placed tombs more than 1,000 years ago. Khotan, on the southern route, was famous and for two prati, but it supplied to the Silk Road trade. Jade and silk. The white and green jade of the Khotan River Valley was prized in Chilana for millennia before the Silk Road was formalized. The jade trade was one of earliest connections between the civilizations of East Asia East Asia. According to Chinese tradition, it was from Hantan that from Kun, the secret of silk production escaped Chinese control. Smuggling Aang's silkworm eggs were two megs to marry a local ruler. Whether true or legendary, the story reflects commercial subsignificance of cultivation spreading west from China across the oasis cities of the Tarim Basin. Chapter 5 Kashgar. The crossroads of everything at the western end of the Tarim Basin, where the northern and southern routes, Kundun Rong, converging from Dunhuang, reunited before the great mountain barriers Centuria. In the from the Chinese world, lay the Kashgar of Kashgar. For nearly 2 millennia, Kashgar occupied one of the most strategically significant of Nenshires of the entire road network. It was the point where the routes coming from China met Collins come the west, the north, and the south, making it a genuine crossroads in the most literal geographic sense. Kashgar's Sunday market, which continues, though in a much transformed form, was already famous in the ancient and of the Guanite commercial gatherings of Central Asia. Merchants from China, Persia, India, the nomadic steppe, converged here to buy and sell, to exchange intelligence about conditions on the roads ahead, to hire guides and additional camels, and to rest after the grueling crossing of the Taklamakan. The ethnic and linguistic diversity of market was extraordinary. A single morning in Kashgar's a bazaar might expose a traveler to traveler, Chinese, Swian, Sanskrit, Bactrian, Khotanese, and the various Turkic Langas and the Vagas, nomadic peoples who inhabited the surrounding steppes. The mountains that surrounded Kashgar on odds were not merely geographic vergraves. Features. The political barriers will killer clum the band school puns and spirit presences is of enormous importance. To the south lay the Karakoram range, and beyond it, the high plateau of Tibet. To the west lay the Palmers, the roof of the world, whose passes at altitudes exceeding 4,000 meters were the gateways to Sogdian, and of Central Asia. To the north lay Tian Shan Range, whose passes connected to the Fergana Valley. The blood-sweeting, the the Han Dynasty Chinese had coveted so too intensely that they had sent armies across the desert to obtain them. The Pamir crossings were among the most feared since of any trans-Eurasian journey. brought altitude sickness, exhaustion, and disorientation. Cold could kill within hours at the wrong season. The paths were narrow and sometimes required crossing glaciers or traversing steep rock faces where a single misstep meant a fatal fall. Yet these passes were crossed continuously for centuries, some or centuries willing to accept in exchange the wrench for the rewards of the train on the other side. The Chinese monk Xuanzang, crossing the Pamirs, on his return from India in the 6th has Scrag, Indians, visceral directness in his travel account. The howling winds, the absence of any plant or animal life, the bitter cold, even in summer. Despite its geographic challenges, Kashgar's was also a place of genuine cultural richness. Monasteries and stupas surrounded the city and dotted the routes, blots leading from it in every direction. The art found in the cave temples of the nearby Kizil Clacks, carved into the cliffs above the Merzent River of the Merzents, presents one of the surviving examples of a cosmopolitan artistic culture of the Silk Road. Images that blend Indian Buddhist iconography with Central Asian, Persian, and even Hellenistic peasants of this extraordinary sophistication and beauty. Chapter V. The Sogdians, merchants of the ancient world. If there is a single Pole who deserves to be called the true masters of the Silk Road, it is Sogdians. The Sogdians inhabited the river valleys of what is now Uzbekistan and Tajikistan and Tajikistan. The fertile lands around the cities of Samarkand, Bukhara, and Panjgand, and from this homeland, they spread their commercial networks across the entire span of the Eurasian continent, with a persistence and a commercial acumen from China's to the Byzantine Empire. The Sogdian language, an Eastern Iranian language written in a distinctive script, served as the primary commercial lingua franca of the Silk Road, with the colonym of the Common Era. Merchants from entirely different linguistic grounds, Chinese, Turkish, Indian, learned Sogdian for commercial purposes, and Sogdian documents have been discovered at sites across an enormous geographic range from from the ruins of Duro Opos on the Euphrates to the manuscripts recovered from the cave temples, Dong. The Sogdian script itself, transmitted through various intermediaries, became the ancestor of several important the old Uyghur script, and through it, the Mongolian and Manchu scripts. The oldest surviving Puv letters in any language, Fantasia, are a collection of Slogshan documents of Fa-Dana watchmen's near Dunhuang, and now known and instance Sogdian letters dating to the early 4th century CCE. These letters, these written by Sogdian merchants based in China to their correspondents back home in Samarkand. Their content is entirely practical. Complaints of delayed shipments, requests for instructions about how to deal with difficult business partners. Reports on political conditions that were disrupting trade. One letter mentions Hisnt eines capital luying that Nameterk Fordzes. A meter historical event that the letter writer records as disreception to this commercial activities. These letters gripped an unmediated glimpse into the daily reality of Silk Road commerce. Stripped, if the Vagrants tend to impose tax. Saudian merchant colony dotted the entire length of the Silk Road, the Central Asia, and into China. These were not temporary encampments, but prominence, where Saudian families made Jamal lanes maintain their language, their religion, primarily Zoroastrianism, with significant communities of Manichaeans, Nestorian, Christians, and Buddhists. The distinctive artistic culture across generations. The fire temples maintained by Sogdiastrians and the Sogdian communities in China attest to the depth of their cultural presence. Sogdian-style vans, textiles is found in Chinese tunes. And the personal possessions of Sogdian merchants who lived and died in China. The commercial network that the Salians maintained. Merely a series of individual merchant ventures. It was a sophisticated system. Augogenly Bashan family merchant houses that extended credit, shared information, managed risk across distances, and maintained the personal relationships with local rulers and official intermediaries that were essential for commercial survival. In a world could change without warning. The Sogdian success in sustaining this network across vast distances and over since the many centuries represents with the more impressive commercial achievements of the pre-modern world. Chapter Face. Samarkand. The heart of Central Asia, Samarkand is one of the oldest continuously inhabited cities in Central Asia and Far Asia. And for much of its long history, it has been one of the most important, situated in the fertile Zirafshan River Valley. Valum, surrounded by agricultural land, all of a large urban population, positioned at the intersections connecting China to Persia, India, to the steppes. Samarkand was almost predestined by its geography to become a great city. For the Silk Road traveler arriving from the east, the first major metropolitan center entered after leaving the Chinese world, a city of palaces and markets, of sophisticated artisans and learned men, of a cosmopolitan culture that had absorbed influences from every direction. The Sogdian city of ancient Samarkand, which is Gurgulakanda, the Grexandrit and Great, captured in 39 29 BCE, was centered on the citadel mound known today as Afrasiab. Excavations at Afrasiab. Some of the most silk-tacular silk-arded herb discovered of wall paintings from a 7th century CE palace. Ambassadors from China, India, Persia, and the nomadic steppes presenting gifts to the Sogdian king. These paintings are a visual encyclopedia of the commercial world and the Silk world of the Silk Road at its height. Every detail of costume, gift, and gesture carefully observed and rendered with extraordinary skill. The ambassadorial painting from Afrasiab shows the Surin from the Hell powers simultaneously. A scene that reflects the genuine political importance of Samarkand in the pre-Islamic period. The city lay at the intersection of Chinese, Persian, and Spain and Mag traders. Thus, its rulers navigated among these competing powers. Diplomatic agility. When the Chinese monk Xuanzang passed the region 3G in Descrides 30s, he described city whose merchants traded across an enormous geographic range and whose population was deeply engaged in the Silk Road economy. The Arab conquest of Transoxiana in the early 8th century Samarkand profoundly. The city became part of the Islamic cant, and Orlama Commerit of Rethlerm overthrew Islam over the following generations, changed its religious and cultural character fundamentally. But Samarkand's commercial and importance survived the transition intact. Under Abbasid patronage, the city became important center for Novazer, Flauwander, and under of manufacture of paper. Technology. The technology that had arrived from China and that was produced instant in Samarkand in quantities sufficient to supply the paper-hungry and if Anis Islamic in scholarly culture of the Islamic world. It was in Samarkand that the most consequential technological in the history of the Silk Road may have occurred. The production of paper in Samarkand, traditionally dated to the mid-8th century CE, was made possible by the knowledge of Chinese paper-making techniques. Yet almost certainly arrived in Central Asia through the movement of skilled craftsmen along Silk Road networks. From Samarkand, paper-making spread westward into the Islerald, and reaching Baghdad, Cairo, and eventually and Europe. The ultimate consequences of this diffusion, the availability of Qing material, the acceleration of intellectual culture were immeasurable. Chapter Fets, the steppe road, nomads, horses, and the northern route. The overland route crossed the mountains and then deserts of Central Asia were not the pathway connecting the civilizations of Eurasia to the north of the Great Mountain Barriers, and the arid interior lay in entirely different kind of landscape. The Eurasian steppe, a vast belt of grassland extending from the shores of the Black Sea in the west to the borders of Manchuria in the east, a distance of more than 8,000. This steppe, so often presented in history as a barrier and a source of destructive nomadic invasions, was also a highway, one of the fastest, most reliable, and in many periods most heavily traveled world. The peoples who inhabited the steppe were pastoralists, moving their herds of horses, cattle, sheep, camps across seasonal circuits that made use of the grass available in regions at different times of year. This mode of life acquired a degree of mobility, sophistication. Le Graf acknowledged that the settled populations of China, Persia, and the Mediterranean frequently underestimated. The nomads of the steppe were not wandering aimlessly. They were following understuffens. The understuffenders that had been refined over generations. And they maintained complex social and political structures that allowed them to govern large territories and to project power with devastating effectiveness. The horse was the defining technology of the steppe, and the steppe mastery horsemanship gave them oversets that things dale oversettled that persisted for more than two millennia. But horses were also a commodity, and the trade in horses. The saddles, this East Asia, was one of the oldest in the worlds. Road world. The Han Dynasty's Chinese were suspired for the horses of honor, taller and more powerful than the native Chinese Chinese, that they sent military XP across the Taklamakan Desert to obtain them. The Tang Dynasty maintained a vast horse-top brand, the Norsemen and the Northwest, and the exchange of Chinese silk for Central Asian and steppe. Feature of the Tang economy. The northern steppe route offered travelers a very different experience from the southern mountain and desert passages. The absence of the great geographic barriers that made the overland routes so dinter meant that determined riders could cover extraordinary distances, relatively short times. Mongol postal relays, they stayed. This instant benefits a transmit method from Kleiner in a matter of a speed of communication that would not be matched by any other system until the telegraph. The steppe route also connected regions, the overland, largely bypassed the fur-producing forests of Siberia, the amber-gathering shores of the Baltic, the silver mines of the Urals, the great nomadic empires, the steppe, the Xiongnu, the Kushans, the Turks, the Kirks, the Khazars, the Mongols, were not the skills to the Silk Road, but its essential infrastructure during the periods of their political dominance, when a single powerful steppe controlled the routes across the grasslands. The security they provided stimulated trade enormously. The Pax Mongolica of the 13th and 14th centuries, the period during which the Mongol Empire, at its greatest extent, controlled a vast swath Eurasia from China to Persia, created conditions of relative safety that allowed merchants like Snopladikma, envoys from the papacy and the European kingdoms to travel from one end to the other with a freedom that had not existed before and would not exist again for centuries. Chapter Feral Merv, the city at the edge of two worlds. In the delta of the Murghab River, where the waters spread from the mountains of Afghanistan into the desert of what is now one day Ministan, lay one of the great cities of the medieval world. Merv, known in antiquity as Margiana and as Alexandria Margiana after Alexander, Cyril the Great founded or refounded it, was at various times the capital of the Parthian Empire's eastern Duran territories, a major center of Zoro religious culture, and under the Igthrid-headed Caliphate, one of the largest cities Islamic world. For any traveler following the overland Silk Road from east to west, Merv was the first major stop after crossing the Karakum Desert as of extraordinary resources that announced the full transition from the central Ain world to the world of the Persian cultural sphere. The city's prosperity was built on its management of water. The Merber's waters directed into an extensive system of canals and irrigation channels, transformed the surrounding desert into productive agricultural land, capable of sustaining a large urban population. This hydraulic infrastructure, developed over many centuries, was Merv's greatest engineering achievement and the foundation of its commercial importance. The city sat on the Indus River east of Bactria and China, west toward Persia, and in the Mediterranean, north toward the steppe and the Aral Sea basin, and south toward the Indus Valley and India. In the 9th and 10th centuries CE, under the Samanid dynasty and their Abbasid overlord, Merv was of intellectual culture of the first order. Its libraries, reportedly held hundreds of thousands of volumes. Its scholars worked on mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and philosophy. The astronomer al-Marwazi, the mathematician al-Khwarizmi, whose name gives us the word algorithm, and whose Arabic rendering of the Indian numerical system gave Western mathematics the Hindu Arabic numeral, Winnie's Arabic numerals we still use. And many other figures of the Islamic Golden Age had connections to Merv and the broader intellectual world it was a part. The physical remains made Merv preserved in extraordinary condition by the aridity of the surrounding desert are today a UNESCO World Heritage Site stretching area of more than 1,000 hectares. The ruins of successive cities, Kala, Jarkala, Sultan Kala, and then medieval city, lie one beside another in the desert, each representing distinct phase of the city's long history. The largest of these ruins, Kala, preserves the outline of an Abbasid era city of enormous extent, with remnants of the Great Mosque, the citadel the vast caravanserais that hosted the commercial traffic of the Silk Road. Merv's End. Merv's End, when it came, was sudden and catastrophic. In 2021, the Mongol of Tolis, son of Genghis Khan, arrived for the city's walls. After siege and a negotiated surrender, the Mongol forces ordered the city's population to assemble in the fields outside the walls, promising safe treatment. What followed was one of the largest massacres of the medieval period. Though certainly exaggerated, described the killing of thousands of people. Mur never fully recovered. The city had been one of the Graben centers, the commerce O's, the virtual networks had shadow. In the commercial networks, it had sustained it, were silvered. It is one of the Silk Road's most devastating examples how fragile urban civilization could be when confronted with the organized violence of the steppe. Chapter Eker, Persia. The Imperial Bridge. No civilization played a more consistently important role in the history than Persia. The great Iranian empires, Achaemenid, Parsianian, Sasanian, Tursanian, or strongly or sign influenced by Turkmenistan fam, sing the Linglium, win the millennium, and Persian cultural influence permeated the entire world in ways that extended far beyond simple political control. The Persian language, Persian artistic styles, Persia's ideas, and Persian commercial practices shaped the Silk Road world at every level. The Achaemenid Empire of the 6th to 4th centuries BC-CE had a steepy, palish and a stecral, an infrastructural framework, within which early Silk Road commerce operated. Darius the Great's Royal Road, running from the Aegean coast of Anatolia to the Persian capital of Susa, a distance of destined house even town 700 Statander rears and West Rainthor, which maintained with imperial relaying stations at regular intervals that allowed royal message to travel entire length in approximately 7 days. Private merchants also use Nuts Road. Persian imperial administration provided long-distance commerce feasible on a scale that had not previously been possible in the western part. Road network. The Parthians, who replaced Hellenist Seleucid Empire as the dominant power in Iran and Mesopotamia in a sense that onward. The CE where perhaps the most commercially oriented of the great Iranian dynasties. Their possession made them the natural intermediaries in the mode long distance trade of the ancient world. Parthian merchants and the Sogdian traders who operated under Parthian protection carried Chinese silk westward to Roman markets and Roman gold and glass eastward toward the consumer societies of Asia. The enormous profits of this intermediary trade were a major source of Parthian imperial wealth. The Sasanian Empire succeeded the Parthians in the 3rd century CE and lasted until the conquest of the 7th century. Brought Persian influence on the Silk Road to its greatest intensity. Sasanian Persian art, murk in silver and gold. Its silk textiles or repeating roundel patterns containing teeming animals or hunting scenes. Its rock-cut reliefs celebrating braiding royal triumphs spread across the entire Silk Road network had profound influences on the artistic traditions of China, Central Asia alike. Sasanian silver vessels have been and on Gekel's contexts from western France to the steppes of Siberia. Breach of Persian prestige goods. The Persian city of Ctesiphon on the Tigris River, the Tigris River south of modern Baghdad, Saladad, a Sasanian imperial capital, and the largest cities during the 5th and centuries CE. Its palace complex, of which the Iwand of Khosrau, a vast audience hall with an enormous vaulted ceiling, survives in ruined form today, was one of the architectural wonders of the ancient world. The court of the Sasanian Shahs was an international gathering. Ambassadors from Byzantium, India, and China attended. Isn't from across the known world. King Orgrul came on 2 commissions, and the commercial wealth that flowed through the empire's markets funded an extraordinary flourishing of art, literature, and intellectual culture. Chapturks, the Maritime Silk Road. Monsoons, ports, and the sea, for all the romance attached to the image of the camel caravan, the desert, is the substantial proportion of the trade we call Silk Road commerce, traveled not by land, but by sea. The maritime routes connecting East Asia, Southeast Asia, South Asia, the Persian Gulf, and were in many respects more efficient than the overlanded. Ships could carry far greater quantities of goods than camels at lower cost per unit and with fewer of the political complications that arose when land routes crossed multiple jurisdictions. The key to the maritime Silk Road was the Muin system. The monsoons blows from the southwest across the Indian Ocean from approximately to September, and from the northeast from approximately Puck Marbor to March. This regular, predictable reversal of wind direction meant that sailors who understood the system could make reliable round-trip voyages between the Persian Gulf or the Red Sea and the coasts of India, by Southeast Asia and China, by timing their departure, took advantage of one monsoon and their return voyage on the other. This knowledge, which sailors had accumulated over many centuries, practical experience transformed the Indian Ocean into a maritime highway. That served the maritime Silk Road were among the most cosmopolitan places in the pre-modern world. Calicut on the Malabar coast of India, where Arab, Persian, Chinese, and East Africans converged trade. Heather's Fits in Dyer City. Huanzhou, on the coast of Fujian in southern China, the city that Marco Polo described as one of the greatest ports in the world, maintained a large permanent community of Muslim Murts from the Persian Gulf and the western Indian Ocean. And its old city still preserves the ruins of a mosque, Manichaean temple, and Hindu shrines alongside the markers of its majority Chinese population. The spice trade was the great engine of the maritime rove. Pepper, cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg, and makes sex expanse command pisterns commanded pricers on the Mediterranean world that made their transport across thousands of kilometers economically compelling. The Roman Empire spent vast sums on Easterns, and the drain of gold and silver from Rome to the east was a subject of complaint among Roman writers who saw luxury imports as a symptom of moral decay. The Arab geographer Ibn Battuta, writing in the 14th century, described the spice markets of the Indian Ocean ports with a sense of abundance and variety communicates itself across the centuries. Chinese participation in the maritime beats the mattings of road. Salt race ein of Mathli Zealit Foldenplayrag Vin Hia between 404 through 5 and 4 through 33. In then 7 he led 7 enormous 7 invil expeditions into the Washington commanding fleets of up to 300 vessels carrying tens of thousands of sailors, soldiers, and specialists. His ships, the largest wooden vessels ever built, the so-called treasures, reached the Persian Gulf, the Red Sea, and the East African coast. These voyages were primarily diplomatic and commercial in character. In Chinese, and collecting tribute from dozens of kingdoms. When the expeditions ended and China turned away from maritime expansion in the ancient, it was one of history's most consequential reversals. Withdrawal from the sea that left the way open for Portuguese, who rounded the Bifurca hope for the first time in 1588, to establish their own maritime dominance of the Indian Ocean trade. Chapter: Baghdad and the Islamic Golden Age. In 762 CE, in 7th Caliph Al-Mansur founded capital on the western bank of the Tigris River. The Tigris River of the ancient Sasanian city of Ctesiphon. He called it Madinat al-Salam, the city of peace. The world to know it as Baghdad. Within a century of its founding, Baghdad became the largest city in the world outside China. Some estimates its place at over 1 million people at its height. More importantly, for the history of the Silk Road, Beitnart became the medieval of medieval, or the medieval of the real world, where the accumulated knowledge of Greek, Persian, Indian, and Chinese civilizations was translated, synthesized, extended in ways that shaped the development of human knowledge for centuries. The Abbasid Caliphate inherited the Silk Road infrastructure that the Sasanians had maintained, and the commercial networks of the Islamic world. We extended it. Muslim merchants, within a legal and religious framework that extracts remarkable speed. After the initial phase of Arab conquests, the Arabic language, which the Islamic religion made universally important across a vast area from Spain to Central Asia, provided a commercial lingua franca, a complemented and eventually partly supplanted Sogdian of the overland routes. The translation movement centered acts of wisdom in Baghdad, brought Buddhist scholars who rendered Greek full of science fast Pax and science furnix, Persian astronomical and literary works, and Indian mathematicuna Naga into Arabic. This synthesis created the foundation for the Islamic Golden Age, Quranic Golden Age, a period of intellectual achievement in mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and geography and philosophy that extended from the 9th through the 13th centuries and transmitted an enormously enriched body of knowledge to European civilization through later relations. And Spain. The Silk Road was the channel through which this knowledge had originally traveled to the Islamic world, and Baghdad was the laboratory in which process and transformed the geography of the Silk Road was mapped with precision by Islamic scholars who combined the classical Grecical Ramal the practical knowledge of merchants, diplomats, and caliphs who had actually crossed the routes. Al-Idrisi's 12th century world map, then in by the Norman King Roger II of Sicily, represents the culmination of this tradition. An image of the world from Ireland to China, compiled from a vast array of written sources and personal testimonies. Ibn Battutta's 14th street travel account, the Rila, describes a journey of approximately 20,000 kilometers across the Islamic world and beyond, from Morocco to Mali, from Constantinople to China, and constitutes the most comprehensive first-person account of the Silk Road world ever written by a single. The commercial prosperity of Abbasid Baghdad was supported by those that represented a genuine revolutionary distance trade. The use of letters of credit, Suftaha, allowed merchants to transfer money across vast distances without the risks of carrying gold or silver physically. The system of commercial structures allowed the pooling of capital, the sharing of multiple of risk across investors. A network of banking houses' main branches is in municipal these commercial transactions to be settled through book transfers rather than physical payment. These financial innovations transmitted westward through the elections through Bengazons. Young Angers began saying that banking and Zengans at Remirum, Modern Europe, chapter tours, religions on the road, Buddhism, Islam, Christianity, and the movement of faith. Of all the things that traveled along the Silk Road, perhaps none had consequences than religion. The great faiths of Eurasia did not simply coexist cities in the cities and caravanserais, these of the Silk Road network. They spread, competed, transformed, and some cases disappeared, carried by merchants, pilgrims, and missionaries, and rulers along the same routes that carried silk and spices. The Silk Road was the greatest instrument of religious diffusion in human history before the age of European global expansion. Buddhism was the first of the great international religions to use the Silk Road as its vehicle of expansion, originating in the Ganges plain of northern India in the 5th century, 5th BCE, and already spread to the early cities of Central Asia of the early centuries. By the early countries of the Common Era, carried by merchants and missionaries who followed the routes connecting India to the Tarim Basin, and beyond. By the 1st century CE, Buddhist, this community that straddled the routes between India and in Central Asia. And Buddhist missionaries were beginning to make their way into China. The Buddha's teachings, the Gnostic institutions that embodied and the distinct that expressed them, all traveled eastward along the Silk Road with remarkable speed. The cave temples of the Silk Road, Dunhuang's Mogao Caves, Kizil Caves, the temples of Bamiyan and Gamian are among the most magnificent physical testaments to this Buddhist expansion. At Dunhuang alone, more than 90 temples, carved and decorated between the 4th and 14th centuries CE, creating a treasury of Buddhist art in Chinese, Central Asian, Tibetan, and Indian styles that gives an unparalleled visual record of how Buddhism absorbed and transformed local artistic traditions as it traveled. The library cave at Dunhuang, held around the year 1000 CE and rediscovered conquered in 900, contained approximately 40,000 manuscripts and other objects in Chinese, Tibetan, Sogdian, Sanskrit, other languages. The most important single cache of Silk Road documents ever discovered. Islam, bred Iranian. From the Iranian speed, after the death of the Prophet Muhammad in 630 CE, in 600 CE, CC'd. The eastern edges of the Iranian world within 2 decades, and Central Asia within another generation. The conversion of the peoples of Central Asia by Islam was a process that played out over several centuries. But by the 10th century, the major oasis cities of the Silk Road, from Samarkand, Kashgar, were predominantly Muslim. The expansion of Islam transformed the religious landscape of the central sections of the Silk Road permanently, but it did immediate disrupt commercial actual activity. Muslim merchants proved as adept at Silk Road commerce as their Zoroastrian predecessors in the Islamic worlds. And the Islamic world's commercial sophistication gave new to the trade networks. Nestorian Christianity. A clergyate heretical adeptsil of Ephesus and Fudsiwi in subsequent years, 31 CE, subsequently expelled from the Byzantine Empire, found its way along the Silk Road to Persia, Centrasia, and Central Asia, and eventually China. The Nestorian Church maintained communities across an enormous geographic range, with bishops in cities from Ctesiphon to Chang'an. A stone stele discovered in Shihan in 1625, erected in 25. 8 in 781-5, erected in 79 AE, and now known as the Nestorian style, records in Chinese and Syriac, the history of the Christian community in China and testifies to the remarkable distances across which this faith had traveled. Manichaeism, a syncretic religion, and in 3rd century, the combined Aranscient, Dalemans, and combined elements of Zoroastrianism, Christianity, and Buddhism also spread along the Silk Road routes, finding converts among the Sagalians and at various times achieving official support from rulers, apart as the Uyghur Khaganate, Central Asia, and the Umayyad Caliphate. Chapter today. Marco Polo and the Mongol century in 1271. 271. A 17-year-old native merchant sent moths from Venezuela, and Nicholas and his uncle Matthew, his uncle curfew on a journey of Kublai Khan in China, and keep him Europe for 24 years. The account he dictated after his return, known as the travels of Marco Polo, or Ian, became one of the most widely read and debated texts of the medieval world. Its descriptions of the wealth of Cathay, the sophistication of Chinese cities, and the grandeur of the Mongol court seemed so extraordinary that many doubted its truthfulness. Yet modern scholarship has confirmed the accuracy of a remarkable proportion of Marco Polo's descriptions. Marco Polo could make his journey because of the Pax Mongolica, the peculiar form of stability that those in the Mongol Empire imposed on a vast swath of Eurasia in the 13th and 10th centuries. The Mongol conquests been catastrophic for the cities and peoples in their path. The destruction of Merv Baghdad, and dozens of urban centers represented some of the worst human disasters of the medieval period. But the empire that the Mongols built on the ruins of what destroyed was, in its own brutal way, an instrument of connection, a single political authority, fractured into four successor states after the death of the great Khan Monkey in 159-259. But still recognizing a degree of Grievan allegiance, controlled the Eurasian steppe from China to Persia, and provided a framework for the trade that had not existed. The Mongol postal relay system, the M, was the physical infrastructure that made the Pax Mongolica possible. Relay stations positioned at regular intervals across fresh horses, and for official couriers and authorized travelers, allowing messages and goods to move across the empire at speeds that would have seemed miraculous generations. Marco Polo's of the YAM system communicum, his genuine admiration, sufficient under European Imthene. This the YAM makes the achievement even more impressive. The YAM was not available to ordinary travelers. Creators created a general climate of organa grunnance along the routes that benefited commercial traffics as well. The papal envoys who preceded and accompanied the Paufianese Asiatic like Giovanni da Pian del Carpin, who reached the Mongol court in 246, and William of Rubruck, who visited in U-553, had come to explore the possibility of a Christian Mongol alliance against the Islamic powers that blocked access the Holy Land. They found at the Mongol court the Christian allies they had hoped for, but something more interesting and more challenging. A genuinely cosmopolitan court, which Nestorian Christians, Buddhists, Muslims, and shamanists all sought favor and influence, and at which the question of which religion the Khan would ultimately favor was a matter of an uncertainty. The Mongol court's competitive religious pluralism was itself a product of the Silk Road world, a cult that had absorbed too many religious traditions to commit wholly any one of them. The Black Death that swept through up in the Middle East, Europe in the mid-14th century, traveled along the Silk Road routes. The disease caused by Bezbek, Yersinia pest, hide and transmitted pike fleas, sporons Mongols of the Mongol Empire with devastating efficiency when it reached the Black Sea port of Kafr. In 1046, reportedly carried Imani by Mongol besiegers, catapulted the bodies of plague victims over the city walls. Over the city walls, it found passage onto the ships of Genoese merchants who silly mainland. And the Italian mainland, the Black Death killed somewhere between an herd and half of Europe's population in the following years, and the Phil-E. And the Middle East, the Silk Road, which had been a conduit of goods and grundias and ideas across Eurasia, had become a conduit for death. Chapter Kyritus Lifa on the road for all the grand historical forces that shaped the Silk. Rising and falling, religion spreading, technology diffusing, the actual mechanisms by which goods moved across these vast distances was the caravan. The caravan was at once an economic institution, a social community, and understanding how caravans actually functioned gives the most direct, divisible, posteros to the lived experience of the Silk Road, a caravan assembling in a major city. This ready you seti or seti yon lani wanvins then on complexity and logista preparation merchants who intended to travel together coordinate their deed, agree on the division of responsibilities, and negotiate of their commercial cooperation. A large caravan might dozens of individual merchants with their goods, their own servants, traveling together for mutual security. The total number of animals, camels, horses, and sometimes donkeys, or oxen, depending on the terrain, could run into the hundreds. And the human complement, including merchants, servants, guards, and specialists, could number in the thousands. The Bactrian camel, the two-humped variety native to Central Asia, the essential animal of the overland Silk Road. Its adaptations to the harsh environments of the Central Asian routes were precisely suited to the demands of the journey. It could survive 4 days without water, carry loads of 200 kilograms over rough terrain, withstand the extreme cold, extreme clang voutsassens, and the extreme of desert crossings, and navigate soft sand without the difficulty horsed. The camel's pace, around 40 kilometers per day on good terrain, set the rhythm of the caravan's progress and determine the spacing of the oases' stops and caravanserais that the route required. The caravanserai was the infrastructural unasrik of the Silk Road. The chains, inns, and way stations that made long-distance travel logistically possible. A K provided freighted travelers, Endemans, First-class, scorched wurge, whole goods, fresh water, and sometimes fodder and provisions for purchase. The finest caravanserais, built by rulers who understood that promoting road traffic was economically advantageous. Substantial architectural achievements. Large enclosures with a central choral courtyard surrounded by covered arcades, providing in individual rooms for merchants and stalls for animals. The Sultanhani Caravan Kayai in Anatolia, built in the 13th century by the Seljuk Sultan Kekubad, represents the type at its most ambitious. A complex of rooms, halls, and a small mosque arranged around a central courtyard, capable of comfortable accommodation. For a large caravan, the social world of the caravan was a compressed version of the larger Silk Road world, bringing together people of languages, religions, and cultural backgrounds in a condition of forced proximity. The generate both vocal harmony and intense conflict. Caravans needed to agree on the pace of travel, the timing of rest stops, the handling of disputes, and the response to external threats. The caravan leader, known different languages as the Caravanbashi, the Sarband, or by other titles, was responsible for making these decisions and for maintaining collective discipline on which everyone's safety depended. Accounts of caravan life. Accounts of caravan lives prevaris of Freifia. Anxiety, hyacate, and occasional wonder drives the experience crossing Central Asia by Flemon many months. Chapter 3 Technolis. The road carried in both directions. The most enduring legacy of the Silk Road was not silk, not spice, and not even the religious transformations it made possible. It was the exchange of practical knowledge, in a cockfuncture asses, the mephalic funk gases, analogations, and mathematical concepts that the technological development of Eurasian civilization occurred than a millennium, paper, then inted in China during the Han Dynasty and brought to curiform Bayat Itlethlanas Halana. Rel on 100 on 105 CE was perhaps the most consequential single theurgy that Silk Road carried westward. The use of paper gradually papyrus and parchment passed then across the Islamic world from the 8th century onward, providing a writing surface that was cheaper to produce, more flexible in its uses, and more readily available in large quantities, add either of the older materials. The consequences for literacy, for administrative fear and efficiency. Am paper per papermaking eventually reached Europe, rets through its Spain, for Islamic Spain and Sicily. It continued them to print its Surrey printations for the print revolution of the 15th century. Printing itself. Blick printing, developed in China during the Tang Dynasty and refined in the following centuries. Also, a love traveled along silk routes and less wood, less of paper. Of paper, block printed texts, and in it is circulated among Buddhist communities a Central Asian routes from the period onward. The Gutenberg press of the 1950s, a European invention that combined the Chinese-derived concept movable type with European innovations in inlaity and mechanical design, but the underlying idea of mechanical type production was not a purely European creation. Agricultural exchanges along the Silk Road routes were equally consequential. Though less visible in the historical record, cotton, which originated in India and South Asia, spread westward through Persia and the Islamic world, transforming the textile industries every region. Sugarcane. Another Aelanthilanthan followed a similar trajectory. Citrus fruits, peaches, apricots, and melons moved in various directions along the routes, canine landscapes, and the diets of the peoples who adopted them. The medieval Islamic world was especially active center of agricultural diffusion, systematically acclimatizing and redistributing crop plants from across the rocks, the network of routes. The route its commercial contacts commanded. Military technologies also traveled the Silk Road with consequences. State political power across Eurasia. The stirrup, a deceptively simple device, gave mounted riders stable platform from which to fight. Spread from China or Antral Asia westward through the Islamic world and Europe, transforming cavalry warfare in ways that some historians have seen as foundational to the social structure of European fieldom. Gunpowder, developed in China as a byproduct of Taoist alchemical experimentation and first used militarily in the 10th and 11th centuries CE, began its long westward journey along Silk Road routes, reaching the Islamic world by 13th century. Short thereafter, the consequences of that diffusion, the obsolescence of armored cavalry, the vulnerability of medieval fortifications, the democratization of military power, define the boundary between the medieval and early modern worlds. Of Worlds, Chapter The Sea, Constantinople, where east meets west, at the western terminus of the overland Silk Road. Routes through Anatolia, and at the meeting point of the Silk Road's overland and maritime branches. Stood the city that was the most the wealthiers and most in the full city in the Christian world, Constantinople, founded by the Roman Emperor Constantine the Great in 330 CE on the site of the ancient Greek city of Byzant and Ditton, and destined to serve as the capital of the Byzantine Empire, and 1453, Octopatic Dofapa III, occupied a geographic position of unparalleled strategic and commercial importance. The city sat at the narrow strait connecting Lac Sea, the Truine, the Ping between Tlafik, Twi, between the two seas. Between the two seas, over a ship carrying goods from the Black Quartz. The overland routes of the steppe and the northern Caucasus were accessible to them. The markets of them, the Mediterranean, had to pass through waters that were effectively under Byzantine control. The customs revenues generated by this bravade, the Chocolathe, were an enormous source of imperial wealth. And the Byzantines have assisted in commercial infrastructure. Including great covered market of the Mies, the Ladora, of the Golden Horn Harbor. The Byzantine silk industry was one of most important consequences of the empire's position in the Silk Road network. Raw silk was imported from China and from the silk producing regions of Persia and the Levant. Constantine Renebles Reus the Cross, their weavers produced silk textiles that were renowned across the medieval world for their technical quality of their designs. Byzantine silk was a prestige commodity across both the Islamic world and Christian Europe, and Christian Turkey and Larns. Large roundels containing paired animals, hunters on horseback, and other motives show the direct indirect influence of Sasanian Persian textile design, which had itself absorbed Central and Chinese influences. The flow of artistic inspiration crossed perhaps the snow or where nowhere God clearly Clive Bam. Poirain, Tectine, silk textiles. The city's markets were stocked with goods from across the Silk Road world. The Venetian traders who maintained Khmer colonies in the of Khmer Conference word Verdantina from the medieval period onward were the primary agents of Silk Road goods. The Lurter's Peen Market and the enormous profits this trade financed the flourishing of Venetian commercial culture, spices from the Indian Ocean, silk from China and Persia, from near Persia, from ocean forests of Arists, amber from the Baltic, and luxury goods of every kind moved through the Byzantine commercial shell system and into the hands of European consumers, whose demand for these products would eventually drive the European age exploration. When Constantinople fell to the Ottoman Turks under Sultan and Mehmed and Thu on May 29th and Plymouth, the Bidfloeth, History 3. One chapter of at Silk Road history closed, even as another opened. The Ottoman Empire that succeeded the Byzantine self, a major Silk Road power, controlling the Lelian of Anatolian, later Troland and Lateland Andrand, and attaining commercial relationships with the late ships, with the Safavid Persian Empire to the east, and later the controlled, and later Ottoman-controlled Arab up to the south. But the fall of Constantinople exhaled the process, or the process already underway. The search by European Patters Parasdov Domes alternative sea routes to Asia that would bypass the Ottoman intermediaries and mediaries if direct access to the sources of the luxury goods on which European consumers had become dependent. Chapter Sasach. The end of one road and the beginning of another. The Silk Road did not end with a single decisive event. Faded across a long period, during which the conditions that had sustained were gradually altered by forces no single politic or commercial or controlled. The Black Death had disrupted the Mongol commercial system. Mongol Empire, the Mongol it segregated. Successor states that were often more interested in fighting one another and maintaining freely of trans-Eurasian trade. And from the 15th century onward, the sea routes that the Portuguese, Spanish, that is the sentence, offer alternatives to the overland routes that were cheaper, more loyal liable, and capable of handling much larger volumes of cargo. The Portuguese rounding of the Cape of Good Hope by Bartolomeus Innertoril in Inforte A8 and Vasco 888 and Vasco Valdo Remus first complete voyage to in India in 1449 in 7 in Vines 4 blind Juan 7 to 1 then for Ford 99 are often treated as the moment when the Silk Road ended. This is an oversimplification. The maritime routes of the Indian Ocean had always carried a substantial share of east-west trade, and the Portuguese intervention in these routes was an disruptive rather than immediately decisive. The overland Silk Road continued to carry dreams longs in the 17th century, particularly in goods for which the overland retained had been a political accessibility. What the opening of the Cape route ultimately, when the band bounced its initial power in the near Eurasian world, or the Eurasian world, goods that had previously through the hands of Central Asian, Arab, Persian Arab, El Arab, and Byzantine intermediaries, each of whom extracted a portion of the value, could now move from their point of production directly to European consumers through a chain of European merchants themselves controlled the enormous profits that had sustained the commercial cultures of Samarkand, Merv, and Baghdad began to flow instead to Lisbon, Antwerp, and Amsterdam, the centers of the world economy, to the coast of Europe. The heartland of the Silk Road for a millennium began its long transition to the marginality that it has largely occupied in the modern era. Yet, the legacy of the Silk Road is not diminished by the changes that ended it as a commercial system. The religions it had spread, Buddhism, express across South Central Asia and into China, Nestorian Christianity across the Asian heartland had transformed the spiritual lives of hundreds of millions of people and ways that no subsequent development reversed. The technologies it had diffused, paper, printing, dex number system, Nilta system, silk goog, cotton, gunpowder, had restructured the material foundations of Eurasian civilization. The artistic vocabularies it had exchanged the lotus motifs of Buddhist art, the roundel patterns of Sasanian textiles, the blue and white porcelain designs that combined Chinese ceramic tradition with Islamic cobalt, had ended the visual culpals of peoples from Japan to Europe, and were too deeply embedded to be did. The Silk Road was, in the end, something more than a trade route and something more than a series of historical events. It was the first sustained experiment in globals playing out across more than a millennium, that the exchange of goods, ideas, and people across vast and cultural distances was not merely possible, but was one of the most for human development that has produced. The civilizations at each end of the road, the ones in, were not the same after the road connected them as they had been before. They had absorbed one another's technologies, adopted one another's artistic forms, converted to one another's religions, borrowed one another's words and mathematical concepts, hence Engelbren and agricultural plants. They had become, in most consequential sense, part of a shared world. Chapters say 2. The eternal world, and the living Silk Road, more than 5 centuries after the Chlorsen of the European age of exploration. The routes themselves, never quite ceased to matter. They persist in the landscapes they crossed. They crossed in the cities they built, in the cultural traditions they created, and in contemporary geopolitical imagination that continues to find them a template for understanding. Tabandis as Mulatan, the Eurasian connection. The cities of the Silk Road, Xi'an, Dunhuang, Kashgar, Samarkand, Bukhara, Mera, Isfahan, Bad Befahan, Bad Constantinople, survived as living urban centers, whose identities inseparable from the cultural roles they once played. Samarkand and Bukhara in Uzbekistan, perhaps the most beautiful was beautifully preserved. All Silk Road cities, visitors from across the world to their turquoise, their called mosques, their tiled madrasas, and bustling bazaars. The Registan Square of Samarkand, framed on 3 sides, monumental, Timurid architecture, decorated with geometric tile patterns, whose visual complexity still astonishes, is one of these magnificent and metextual ensembles in the world, the product of a culture at the intersection of Central Asian, Persian, Chinese, and Indian traditions. The archaeological wealth of the Silk Road routes continue space scurries. New scripts are still being recovered from the Sale Moon, from within the Senate. The ancient oasis cities, new analysis of well-known artists continual cultivations. They embody DNA analysis of ancient human remains. Solulamanes, the lunar means of migration and admixture across Eurasian history. History with a precision that no Amantal could achieve. The Silk Road has never been more intensely studied than it is today. Each generation of Scotsons find the questions and it has left behind. In 2013, the Chinese government announced the and Road Initiative, an ambitious program of infrastructure investment across Asia, Africa, and Europe that explicitly invoked the Silk Road as its historical precedent and symbolic model. The announcement captured the imagination of commentators around the world precisely because historical riffle powerfulness of so powerful. The idea of Jia of China once again at the center of Eurasian network of exchange, projecting economic influence along routes that the ancient road had pioneered, whether the comparison to the historical Silk Road illuminates its work you mate of Orangutans initiative is a matter of ongoing debate. The fact that a 21st century geopolitical program is funking commercial network of defining a metaphor speaks to the enduring power of silk, the fraud idea. There is a moment that every traveler who has crossed the Central Asian steppe, followed the edges of the Klimakan Desert describes a moment. The moment when the landscape asserts itself so powerfully that the historical imagination is overwhelmed. The silence of the desert at night, the stars blazing overhead with an intensity impossible in any city, in Pansai in then plight, the St. Islands omens a caravans ride, the roadside with its scroggling walls, still hunting the outline of the rooms where merchants once counted their merchandise by lamplight. In those moments, the Silk Road ceases to be a historical concept and becomes something more immediate. A reminder that the human drive to connect, to exchange, across the distance between here and there, is as old as civilization itself, and that the roots by which the world has been made, smaller and more shared, are among the greatest achievements of our species. The road gone. It always has, in the container ships crossing the Indian, on the Ocean, and the freight trains running weekly between Chinese manufacturing Minipes and European markets, In the internet cables that carry data along routes that sometimes trace the ancient caravan roads, and the languages and legends and mathematical concepts and crop plants that are still, because traveled them, carried them across mountains, deserts. The Silk Road continues its work. It is the longest and most consequential story of human connection ever told. And its final chapter has not yet been written.